James spotted the small, round blister pack on the bathroom counter. Its silver foil caught the light, and he frowned. He picked it up and turned it over. The pack didn't look like anything they normally had in the house. Curious, he set it down and checked the cabinet. Then he pulled out Rebecca's makeup drawer, searching for any sign of what the pills could be for. At the back of the drawer, behind some old perfume bottles, he found it, a small cardboard package. His heart thudded as he read the L. They were birth control pills. James blinked, hardly able to believe what he was holding. He'd had a vasectomy after their son Sam was born, and they hadn't needed any kind of contraceptive since then. He glanced down the hall to make sure the kids, Emily, 6, and Sam, 4, were still playing in the living room. He felt a pang of dread. He didn't want them to sense anything wrong. His mind raced. There was only one reason Rebecca would need birth control pills, and it didn't involve him. James placed the box back exactly where he found it and closed the drawer. James took a step back, trying to process the shock and hurt he felt. He wasn't ready to confront Rebecca. He needed to know the full story. If she was keeping secrets, he'd need to be patient and strategic to uncover them. James left the bathroom, his mind full of questions and a resolve forming within him. Whatever was going on, he was going to get to the bottom of it. His mind still reeling at 37, he'd always prided himself on being sharp and observant. These traits had served him well in his career as a marketing specialist. For years, his job had kept him busy on road trips to meet clients, long flights, and nights spent in hotel rooms working late. Now that his company allows hybrid work days, he's been home more often, closer to his family and his life with Rebecca and the kids. After discovering the birth control pills that morning, however, the comfort of home felt shaken. His mind kept circling back to his discovery. Rebecca had already left for work, and he was left to handle the kids' morning routine alone. Emily, their 6-year-old, was particularly challenging. Year-old and Sam, just 4, were bundled up in the car, laughing and playing, totally unaware of their father's troubled thoughts as he drove. An idea began to form, a practical solution that would give him answers without involving Rebecca in his suspicions. He would arrange for a DNA test just to make sure he was truly Emily and Sam's father. As the thought settled, another plan took shape. He could install a few small surveillance cameras around the house, cameras with audio so he could monitor what went on when he wasn't home. He wanted to know exactly what Rebecca did on the nights he worked late or had client calls. If something was going on, he'd have proof. He dropped Emily off at school and said Sam at daycare. All the while, he was thinking about the details. He would need to be discreet. He would take small DNA samples from each of the kids and find a reputable lab for testing. The cameras would be harder to hide, but he knew enough about technology to set them up so Rebecca wouldn't notice. He spent his days planning in secret. Whenever he had a moment alone with Emily or Sam, he collected a few hairs from their brushes and swabs from their toothbrushes. He packaged the samples carefully and sent them off to a lab under a name he'd made up just for the task. On a night when Rebecca went out with friends, he installed 3 small cameras around the house, one in the living room, one in the kitchen, and one in their bedroom. Each camera was tucked away and nearly invisible. But it could record sound and video with high quality, with everything in place. James finally felt a strange sense of control returning. He just needed a way to observe without raising suspicion. One evening over dinner, he casually mentioned that he'd be working late the next week. He had a new project on top of everything else. He said, feigning frustration, "I'll probably be in the office until late most nights." Rebecca just nodded, seeming unsurprised. "That's okay," she replied. "Actually," she replied, It's quieter for me right now, so I'll have time to catch up on our kids." She smiled reassuringly and reached over to give his hand a quick squeeze. James forced a smile back. His mind was already churning with what he might learn once she was home alone. He looked forward to seeing what the cameras would show him each day. He would leave the house, linger in the car a moment, and then drive to the office. James spent the week piling on extra work at the office, staying on top of everything. By the time he got home, he was nearly the last one out. Every evening, before heading to bed, he'd settle into his chair, open his laptop and review the camera footage from the day. For the first few days, everything seemed routine. Rebecca had taken a couple of days off work to stay with the kids and run errands. He saw her making dinner, taking the kids to school and even folding laundry. It was mundane, almost comforting, but on Thursday something shifted as he skimmed through the recording. James noticed her sitting in the living room on the phone, her voice low but urgent. The sound wasn't great, but he leaned in to listen. From bits and pieces of her conversation, he caught a name that made his stomach tighten: Robert Collins, her boss. She wasn't speaking in a businesslike way. He couldn't make out every word, but it was clear they weren't discussing projects or deadlines. He heard phrases like, "Don't worry, and we can make it." James's hand clenched around the edge of the desk as he watched her leaning back on the couch, laughing softly into the phone as she twirled a strand of her hair. When he closed the footage that night, he felt a sense of dread. It felt like he was seeing a part of Rebecca he didn't recognize, and each passing moment eroded the trust he'd once taken for granted. But nothing could have prepared him for what he saw on Friday. Rebecca was in the kitchen packing lunches and helping the kids were getting ready for school. Sam had a backpack that was nearly half his size, and he was laughing as Rebecca knelt down to his eye level. James turned up the volume, and that's when he heard her say, "So, kids, when you're done with school today, we're going to visit Robert for a few hours." The children's faces lit up with excitement, and Emily clapped her hands. But before James could even begin to process why Rebecca would take the kids to see her boss, he heard her say something that froze him to the core. "Remember, this is our little secret. If Daddy finds out, the evil fairy will come and take him away, so we have to be extra careful." The kids nodded eagerly, their faces solemn. Sam whispered, "We won't tell Mommy," and Emily repeated it with an innocent pride that made James's heart twist. James sat there stunned, his pulse thundering in his ears, his mind racing. He kept coming back to that one thing that made him so angry: Rebecca was hiding something, and now she was using their children to help her do it. He almost threw the laptop across the room. His hand was gripped so tightly on the edge of the desk that his knuckles were white. But he forced himself to breathe and stay calm. He needed to stay level-headed if he lost control, because if he did, he'd lose his chance to understand what was going on. He turned off the laptop, feeling a little calmer. He felt a sickening weight settle over him. The final piece of the puzzle, the DNA test results, could arrive any day, so he waited. Anger simmered under the surface. His mind was filled with questions he wasn't sure he wanted the answers to, but one thing was certain: the Rebecca he knew was slipping away, and with her, the life he thought he'd built. To find out what happens next, please subscribe to the channel. That night, James came home later than usual. The kids were already in bed, and Rebecca was lounging. On the couch, she was scrolling through her phone with a tired smile as he walked through the door. She looked up at him and said, "Yeah, another long one." He replied, forcing a small smile as he leaned in to kiss her on the cheek. The warmth felt hollow now, like a formality. He fought the urge to pull away, holding on to his composure and acting the part of the tired but loving husband. He asked her about her day, made small talk, even as the image of her secretive words with the kids haunted him. Rebecca he didn't seem to notice his inner turmoil. He laughed at his jokes and brushed his shoulder affectionately as they went through the evening routine. But as the house settled into silence and everyone fell asleep, James lay awake staring at the ceiling in the dark. He couldn't ignore the lies in his family any longer. They were gnawing at him, filling his mind with questions and suspicions. He couldn't ignore Rebecca's secrecy, the strange trip with the children, or the conversations he'd overheard. They were all circling in his head, tightening around him. By 3 a.m., he couldn't take it anymore. He slipped out of bed and grabbed Rebecca's phone, which was on her nightstand. He closed the bedroom door quietly behind him and locked himself in the bathroom. He stared at the phone for a moment, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. He'd never gone through her phone before. They had always respected each other's privacy, but that trust was shattered now. He took a breath, tapped the screen, and began trying passwords. Each attempt was filled with anxiety. After a few wrong tries, he entered Emily's birth date and the screen unlocked. The screen glowed in the dim light of the bathroom as he navigated to her messages. He scrolled through the usual conversations with friends, her mom, and then found the messages from Robert. His breath caught in his throat. As he opened the conversation, he felt a growing sense of dread. Some messages were about work deadlines, upcoming meetings, and the usual office chatter. But interwoven with these were other texts: "Can't wait to see you, same place, miss you." James's hands shook, his stomach tightening as he scrolled. Each message felt like a punch, but the last one he read hit hardest of all. He couldn't leave his husband yet, this transition had to be smooth. James felt the floor tilt beneath him. She had been planning to leave him. This wasn't just some momentary lapse, she'd end it. Something was off. The conversation seemed incomplete, like someone had gone back and deleted parts of it. But this message, this confession, had been left behind. It was sent recently, with steady hands, despite the shaking inside. He took out his own phone and snapped photos of each incriminating message. His mind was in a state of disbelief, caught between the realization that the life he thought he'd built was slipping away and the fact that he'd found proof of it. He quietly returned Rebecca's phone to the nightstand and climbed back into bed beside her. She was fast asleep, completely unaware of the. As the storm raged outside, he stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep as he tried to process everything he'd discovered. James barely recognized himself as he looked in the mirror on Saturday morning. Dark shadows had settled beneath his eyes, and his face looked hollow and almost lifeless. Rebecca noticed it too, her brow furrowing with concern. As they had breakfast, "You look tired," she said gently, reaching out to touch his arm. "Are you okay?" He forced a smile, shaking his head slightly. "It's just been a rough few days, hasn't it?" He could tell she was trying to be supportive, but he could feel her watching him, sensing the distance. He worked hard to keep his emotions in check when she looked at him. He fought down the anger, betrayal, and sadness that threatened to break through. By Sunday night, he was counting down the hours until he could escape the house and go back to work on Monday. Just before noon, James's phone buzzed with an alert. His heart James was taken aback when he opened the email. There it was, the DNA test results. His hands felt numb as he read the words over and over. Disbelief settled into painful clarity. Probability of paternity 0%. The world around him felt as if it had dropped away, leaving him floating in a void. Emily and Sam, they weren't his. James was living a lie. He was raising someone else's children. And Rebecca's secret meetings with Robert made it all clear. Robert Collins wasn't just Rebecca's boss. He was likely the father of the children James had been calling his own for years. He took a shaky breath. Anger was sparking like a wildfire in his chest. His chest felt tight. There would be no easy way out. He'd have to live with the consequences of her lies. He told his boss he needed the rest of the day off for an emergency, then called Angela Miller, a lawyer he'd worked with on a few projects. He was cashing in on her expertise. The favor was a lot more personal than either of them had imagined. The lawyer's office was quiet and modern, with Angela's degrees lining the walls. She greeted him warmly, her eyes bright but steady. "James, it's been a while. You sounded urgent." He was on edge for a moment, searching for the right words. Then, he began to speak, sharing the details of the pills, cameras, secret meetings, and DNA results that had rocked his world. Angela listened intently, her expression focused, her hands folded as he laid out every detail. When he finished, she leaned back. "James," Angela said gently, "I'm really sorry this is a betrayal on every level. But before you take any drastic steps, you need to think carefully about the path forward. Emotionally, this is brutal, but legally, we can build a strong case." James nodded, his anger tempered only slightly by her calm. "Angela, I can't keep living this lie. She's been using me, and now I'm raising another man's children. I don't even know if they're often going to Robert's house to spend time with him when I'm not around." His fists clenched as he spoke. Angela gave a thoughtful nod, choosing her words carefully. I understand. I know you want this done yesterday, but the best outcome will come if we're strategic. Divorce proceedings can get ugly fast, especially when there's infidelity involved and children. She continued, leaning forward, and said, start protecting your assets now. Gather any important financial documents and account statements. James looked at her, his eyes steely. I want to make sure she doesn't get a dime more than she deserves. Angela nodded. We'll push for that, but the court will likely think about what's best for the kids, regardless of who their biological father is. You'll need to be prepared, too. Depending on how things play out, we may need to contact Robert as part of the proceedings. Good, James replied bitterly. I want him dragged into this. I want both of them to face what they've done. Angela's voice was soft but firm. We'll get there. Just be patient. James replied, let's build this the right way. That means you don't confront Rebecca yet. Let her think everything's normal. In the meantime, I'll get the necessary documents filed. We'll plan out the best approach to come out of this with you on top. He took a deep breath, feeling his anger recede just enough to see the plan forming before him. Angela was right, he had to be smart about this for his sake and for his future. Thank you, Angela, he said quietly. I'll do whatever it takes. With this, James, you're in good hands. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of quiet planning and preparation under Angela's guidance. James took every step necessary to secure his assets and protect himself legally. Together, they documented everything with precision. Angela moved efficiently, drafting a potential fraud charge against Rebecca and including a compensation claim for the years James had unknowingly raised children who were not biologically his. Angela also helped him set up a trust to shield his assets, preserving his savings, investments, and property from being divided in the inevitable divorce. She put together a plan that gave James every possible advantage, getting him ready to leave Rebecca and start over. James felt a growing sense of determination. Everything was in place, he just had to deliver the papers. He prepared the papers and was ready to see what would happen next. One evening, he found Rebecca in the living room, scrolling through her phone with a relaxed expression. It made his heart twist, but he kept his cool, gripping the papers in his hand as he stepped into the room. Rebecca, he said evenly, holding out the documents. We need to talk. She looked up, her expression changing from confusion to shock. Rebecca was confused at first, but as she saw the papers, her expression changed from confusion to shock, then to anger. She took the documents from him and looked at them, her face showing her shock. What is this? She demanded, her voice shaking. Are you seriously doing this? James crossed his arms and spoke firmly. Calm but firm, he said, it's exactly what it looks like, Rebecca. I know everything. Her eyes widened, then narrowed in a flash. Her face was twisted with rage, and her voice dropped to a low hiss. James, you're being insane. Think about the children you're going to destroy with this madness. He shook his head slowly. Rebecca, you did that. You've been lying to me for years, and now you want to use the kids to keep me. I won't be manipulated anymore. Rebecca's anger turned into desperation. Your children, James. You've raised them, you've loved them. What kind of father just walks away? But James refused to be swayed. He looked at her steadily, then turned and left the room. His heart pounding as he walked out of the house and drove away. He drove away and parked at a quiet spot nearby, needing space to think. He sat alone in his car and opened his laptop, connecting to the live feed from the cameras he had installed weeks earlier. He found Rebecca in the kitchen pacing in agitation as she dialed a number. He turned up the volume. He listened as she spoke, her words raw with anger and panic. Robert, she said, her voice trembling. He handed me the divorce papers. He knows, Robert, somehow he found out about everything. It's too soon, he wasn't supposed to figure it out yet. James's pulse quickened as he watched her run a hand through her hair, clearly. She was clearly shaken. I should have filed for divorce first, like we planned, she continued, her voice bitter. If I'd done it sooner, I could have locked everything down before he knew what was going on. But your divorce just had to drag out, didn't it, because of your ex and her fertility issues? I warned you this would happen if we waited too long. James suddenly realized that she'd planned this from the beginning. Every lie, every secret, every word spoken in trust, it was all a calculated move in her twisted game. James whispered a quiet, fervent thank you to whoever had helped him uncover the truth. He was grateful to have caught on in time to protect his assets, his future and, most importantly, himself. James was blindsided and betrayed, but at least he had found out before it was too late to reclaim his life. With Angela's help, he would see this through to the end. James planned a meticulous legal battle to not just end his marriage, but also to expose Rebecca's betrayal in full view of the people she had deceived. It was painful and ruthless work, but after years of living a lie, James was determined to hold her accountable. The first step was to ensure that Rebecca's friends and family knew why she was divorcing James. He'd given them all the evidence he had, including messages between her and Robert, the DNA test results, and explanations of how she deceived him for years. They were shocked, disgusted, and heartbroken. Rebecca was isolated and trying to defend herself as she realized the full reach of James's strategy in court. James took the stand with Angela by his side. He was sure he had the evidence to dismantle Rebecca's defense. The messages, the surveillance recordings, and the DNA tests all painted a clear picture. The court listened as James described the years he'd spent believing in a marriage and family that had been built on lies. He spoke of the emotional toll of the betrayal that had cut deeper than he could have imagined. The judge listened closely, scrutinizing the documents, and ordered that additional DNA tests be conducted to confirm the paternity of Emily and Sam wanted to know once and for all. As the trial went on, the focus shifted to Robert Collins, who had reluctantly been called to testify. He seemed uncomfortable, his face drawn and anxious. It came out that Robert had been living with a childless wife for years. They had been trying to conceive, but had been unable to do so. This had always been a point of tension in his marriage over the past year. His wife had finally sought a divorce, and their separation had become an ongoing battle over assets. The court learned that Robert's finances and his freedom were tied up in property. It also came out that he had been secretly involved with Rebecca for years, maintaining his affair even while pretending to work things out with his wife. Rebecca tried to deny knowledge of the children's true paternity, claiming that she couldn't have known for sure that Robert was the father. She played the part of the oblivious wife, insisting that James's anger had led him to misinterpret her actions. However, the evidence, in the form of dozens of messages and the final DNA results and some intimate conversations, proved that Emily and Sam were Robert's children. The judge was not impressed by Rebecca's denials as her story unraveled at the end of the trial. The judge ruled in James's favor and granted him a legal emancipation from the marriage. This meant that he was no longer financially responsible for Rebecca or her children. The court acknowledged that Rebecca's assets were protected. The judge ruled in James's favor and awarded him significant compensation for the years he had been misled into supporting children who were not his own. As the gavel fell, signaling the end of the proceedings, James felt a profound sense of relief. It was the end of a toxic chapter and a closing of doors on the betrayal and heartache that had ruled his life. James left the courthouse with his head high, feeling like he had reclaimed his dignity and his future with Angela's steadfast support. He had won. He was ready to start fresh. The weeks that followed were full of small victories. He moved into a new home, started focusing on his career with renewed energy, and rediscovered the peace he hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long time, James felt whole. The weight of deception was gone and he was ready to face whatever lay ahead with a clear conscience and a stronger sense of self. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to the channel. I wish you a great mood and good luck.